I must admit I was really delighted by how provocative you thought my question was about whether or not we should characterize ancient Judaism as Judaism or Judaisms. And there was quite a divide in the response in the class, and I really appreciated the liveliness of your responses. Of course, Roy asked me point blank, where I came down on this, and so I guess I have to come clean and say that I agree with him that it's probably best to talk about Judaism in the ancient world, not Judaisms, because there was a considerable amount of commonality that linked the various groups. I posed the question because I really wanted to underline just how diverse Judaism was in the first century in the time of Jesus, as a way for paving an entree for us to consider why it was that Christianity was to be thought of as a reform movement initially within Judaism, and that Jesus came not to establish a new religion necessarily, but to engage in dialogue with his Jewish co-religionists to think differently about what was the heart of their Jewish identity, an engagement that only at some later date came to include Gentile sympathizers, and which ultimately spawned a new religious movement and an identifiably separate religious tradition. I'm going to take that up in just a few minutes, but I'll come clean. I think it's best to speak of a diverse Judaism in late antiquity in the first century at the time of Jesus. I also agree with Tyler's comment, which I think was right on target, that we have to remember that the majority of Jews in the first century, probably 98% of those who were Jews in late antiquity, those who lived not only in Palestine but in the diaspora outside of Palestine, were simply run-of-the-mill Jews who did not identify themselves in any sort of sectarian way, who were more or less identified with their Jewish religious tradition, who more or less identified with Jewish religious observance, given the day of the week, the time of the year, given their other preoccupations. Only a small majority of Jews identified themselves in particular sectarian sorts of ways. The Sadducees, for example, did not come into existence until after the Maccabean revolt, which was precipitated in 175 before the Common Era, and ultimately culminated in Jewish religious freedom in 165, and a reorganization of Judaism that focused on the temple after 165, a rededication of the temple in 164. That's what the Feast of Hanukkah commemorates. But the priesthood that came to function in the temple after 164 was not the same priesthood, not the same priestly aristocracy that held power previously. And the Sadducees held on to their power in a very tenuous sort of way, particularly after the Roman occupation in 63 before the Common Era. And as they sought to run the temple and to walk a very fine line with Roman occupation, the Sadducean identity was one that was very precarious. The Pharisees were a lay movement. They were a minority movement. Even though they occupy a prominent position in the pages of the New Testament, it is because the authors of the New Testament are engaging with Pharisees to whom fell the task after the destruction of the temple in 70, the task of reorganizing Judaism. And also it is because Jesus shared so many sympathies with the Pharisees, and the authors of the pages in the pages of the New Testament are trying to distinguish Jesus from the Pharisees, that the Pharisees come to have such a prominent place. But at the time of Jesus, Pharisees were a very much minority sort of movement. Even more of a minority were the Essenes, who probably were represented by no more than several hundred or a few thousand at the very most adherents at the time of Jesus. It seems likely that John the Baptist probably had his beginnings as a part of the Essene movement, but maybe broke off from that movement, and while he shared some of their apocalyptic fervor, sought to identify himself and perhaps to establish a movement as an offshoot of the Essenes. As I pointed out in my comments to several of you who wanted to mention the fourth philosophy, which Josephus identifies, the fourth philosophy developed in the latter third of the first century of the Common Era into what came to be known as the Zealots. But the Zealots, who were anti-Roman revolutionaries and who sought to precipitate a movement like the Maccabean Revolt from the 2nd century before the Common Era, also included a group of people who were just outright bandits, whose greater interest was economic redistribution, and who took up the cause of zealotry really for the purpose of redistributing wealth and of protesting not only the injustice of Sadducean claims by virtue of the temple tax, but also the exploitative character of the Roman system of taxation. So, bottom line, you have a majority of Jews, probably 98%, going about their daily lives thinking of themselves as members of the historic people of God, whose lives were characterized by circumcision of their male children on the 8th day, keeping kosher dietary laws more or less, thinking of themselves as engaged in a covenant with the one God, who thought of themselves as children of Abraham, who occupied a historic land, whose lives were shaped by scriptures and the aspirations that those scriptures embodied. Those people were referred to by the Pharisees as the people of the land. The other 2%, people like the Pharisees, people like the Sadducees, the Essenes, members of the circle around John the Baptist, and initially members of the Jesus movement, represented a minority within that larger spectrum of first century Judaism. Things changed, however, for the Christian movement when it began to engage in a missionary enterprise to non-Jews. To non-Jews, not only those who lived within Palestine, but especially non-Jews outside of Palestine in the diaspora. And when you ask the question, well, when did Christianity become Christianity? When did Christianity cease to be a reform movement within Judaism or a sectarian movement within Judaism? I would say when when the Jesus movement began to accept non-Jewish members within its ranks and did not demand circumcision for full participation within that movement, when it did not expect converts to keep kosher dietary laws, and when the membership of the Jesus movement came to be represented by a majority of non-Jews and those living outside of Palestine. Only then can we begin to think of a movement that is becoming a different religious and even non-Jewish tradition. That process lasted much longer than we normally think. It continues well into the 3rd century. The boundaries between Jewish identity and Christian identity continue to be very permeable in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. And certainly developments in Christological language, language that begins to give Jesus fully divine status, language which moves in the direction of Christians thinking about a Trinity, which for many Jews seemed to suggest that it was no longer a monotheistic religious tradition, but a bitheistic or even a tritheistic religious tradition. Those sorts of developments too pushed Christianity to be recognized as an identifiably separate religious tradition from Judaism. But in the early years, in the era of the New Testament, which is going to be our concern, in the 1st century of the Common Era, for all intents and purposes, Christianity is, at that point, one of the diverse sectarian elements within late antique Judaism, and we need to appreciate the way in which Christianity both reflects its Jewish heritage, but does so as it emerges into a missionary movement within the Gentile world. When we get to Paul, that's going to be one of the particular emphases that we're going to keep track of again and again and again as we read Paul's letters and the advice he offers to the communities that he establishes, communities which are primarily Gentile Christian, not Jewish Christian.